Greetings, ladies and metal-gents, and welcome to this latest edition of Tales from Outer Space, where I take stories from across the internet and read them for your entertainment. This particular story is called The Mad Ones, written by sonofnobody. Galactic civilization has a hard time agreeing on anything. That's hardly surprising, given that it's a mishmash of dozens upon dozens of sentients from thousands of different planets, only loosely bound together by few laws they mostly agree are necessary, at least on paper. A good example of this is what constitutes a civilized species in the first place. The law books, written in simple, straightforward languages, so as to be translatable into any species' native tongue, state that before first contact is made and a new species is welcomed onto the galactic stage, they must be living beyond their original planet. How this gets interpreted depends a great deal on the species in question, and how the other members of the Grand Galactic Council see them. The Chicks-in-Little, for example, were calm, logically focused omnivores who had given up animal slaughter for meat quite early on, as most omnivore civilizations did. They were very similar to the majority of the races making up said council, so they were welcomed with open arms after launching a research station, where their scientist lives in space for less than a planetary orbit. Humanity, on the other hand, were a fractious, illogical lot who still killed for sport, let alone for food. When they launched their early space efforts, they weren't contacted by the Council until after the construction of a massive orbital habitat, and even then, a minority of the Council members maintained their no vote on the basis that said habitat had only been built because humanity had fecked up its planet so massively with greenhouse gases and other environmental problems that the habitat was a matter of desperate necessity. There were human babies born in space before first contact was made. Another matter that caused constant argument on the Grand Galactic Council was that of heavy gravity sentience. Earth itself skittered close to the definitions of heavy gravity world, and the sheer physical power that came from evolving in such an aggressive gravity well didn't exactly endear humanity to the more timid members of the Council. But Earth was not a true heavy gravity world. Those were characterized by the simple fact that rockets couldn't get anything into space from one. To send an object into space via rocket, whether a simple satellite or a life support capsule with a sentient within, requires fuel to create thrust. The object being sent has mass, which mass requires a given amount of fuel to lift out of the given gravity well. Yet the fuel itself also has mass, which must be added to the total, requiring more fuel, which must be added, requiring more fuel in turn. In lighter gravity wells, those additional numbers shrink rapidly, hardly affecting the numbers for launch. In a deep well such as Earth's, they mean that spaceflight calls for tiny payloads atop massive tanks of fuel. But there comes a point where the gravity is so heavy that even a theoretical rocket, made of the best, purest rocket fuel and nothing else, would still be too heavy for its own energy to lift. And so those worlds come too late, if at all, to the galactic stage. Many on the Council maintain that such is fate. Life is hard. Deal with it. If a species cannot get itself into space, that's not the Council's problem, and changing the law is simply not an option. Heavy gravity worlds have to wait until they invent quantum portals or gravity manipulation, and that's the way it is. Sucks to be them. Others insist that this is hardly fair, and such races should be contacted when they attain their technological level equivalent to that of most early spacefarers, and given assistance to get off their absurdly heavy planets. While others hold a position in between, saying that such races should be helped subtly to get into space on their own, with quiet hints slipped to appropriate scientists, so that they will develop the necessary tech level, thus technically adhering to the galactic law while still giving the unlucky heavy worlders a break. The debate raged, and meanwhile nobody paid that much attention to the middle industrial heavy gravity worlds, because they weren't getting into space anytime soon, so there was no need to check in on them. Then a scouting mission, on their way back from looking at a fairly average world, significantly lighter than Earth and pretty much right in the center of what was considered the galactic norm, happened to swing by a planet Maritau just because they were in the area, and arrived at the Grand Galactic Council station of Ixtnak with news that shocked every single species that heard of it, save perhaps one. The Maritau people had a research station in orbit. It was a very small one, carefully designed to deliver a maximum return with a minimum weight, but there were 3 Maritau aboard it, and nearly 100 satellites in orbit as well. The Maritau were decades, perhaps centuries away from gravity manipulation or quantum portals, so everyone was puzzled. How had they gotten out of their fearsome gravity well? Certainly much deeper than Earth's. One of the deepest known to have produced a rocket-building race without such abilities. Soon dozens, even hundreds of carefully cloaked ships were hovering around Maritau, learning all they could about the people who lived there, trying to solve the mystery. The Maritau people were stocky, compact things, hardly startling for a heavy gravity species. Humanity, with their penchant for comparing absolutely everything to Earth-native animals, dubbed them squidiacs, for they were quadrupeds with thick coats of insulating fur, back with carving horns, and a crest of manipulating tentacles that sprouted from their spinal region. They were herbivores, and fairly placid ones at that. No horn-crashing battles for dominance, no desperate fighting over mating rights, no territorial skirmishes. They seemed to have subsumed such urges into ritualized competitions that in modern times tended as much towards poetry as towards combat. But they were also tough to the point of fearlessness, and shared a rare trait with humanity. They were adrenaline junkies, who did dangerous things for nothing more than the rush of the danger itself. They climbed their world's mountains, despite the madness of seeking high altitude in a gravity much higher than Earth's. They strapped skis onto 4 limbs and sped down said mountains at truly reckless speeds. They held races over distances that would destroy more fragile species in such gravity, and sometimes half-killed themselves doing it. For they were not a species built for running, but they did it all the same. The first impressions had been made, but few details were known to the watching fleet of desperate aliens when the launch that would answer the questions of how in the galaxy these creatures had managed to get into orbit was scheduled. View screens lit across all Maritau's surface, but out near the moon's orbit, hundreds more also displayed the launch pad with its oddly shaped, stocky ship, perched atop a nearly flat disk that looked like nothing like a rocket nozzle. The launch carried 2 astronauts, meant to replace 2 of those now in orbit, as well as a landing shuttle to carry their colleagues down to the planet. But there was no attending crew, and no tower or gantry supporting the ship. In fact, there was nothing whatsoever for miles and miles. The ship's launch was in the center of uninhabited desert, a strange decision given the effort required to transport it and everything necessary for its launch there. Control relays were remote, designed to deal with the brief delays that came with sending commands from massive distances, and absolutely everything was automated, done by non-sentient robots rather than by living beings. The countdown began, and while on the planet thousands of beings held their breath and billions more went about their days without considering the launch at all. In orbit, thousands more watched with intense anticipation. Then, the blast unfolded from beneath the ship, flinging it skyward, not on a pillar of cloud, but on an expanding ball of impossible fire that eventually became a familiar shape. A mushroom cloud, with a trail of arcing upwards from it, marking the spaceship's path. A second explosion detonated in midair, propelling the rocket faster still. The broadcast from the cockpit, as the rocket picked up speed, sent across the planet and relayed into space by stealth probes, was fuzzed by radioactive interference, but was nevertheless clear enough for a translation. "Whoa! Yeah, go, baby, go!" On the Texan little ship, somebody said, "Oh, sweet ancestors, they're nuking themselves into space." Somebody else, slightly incredulous but almost admiringly, said, "Well, rocket ignitions are technically explosions even back home." Meanwhile, on the bridge of the EMS Zero Gravitas, a chorus of admiring whistles and murmurs were put into full voice by one human lieutenant saying, "Goddamn crazy bastards, they built Orion." The Maritau ship rose and rose in spurts and stutters, regularly kicked higher by titanic balls of thermonuclear fire, and all the galaxy watched it rise, until at last it broke the bounds of gravity and achieved escape velocity. Smaller thrusters that had steered and stabilized it all the while now took over, guiding it into an orbit that would eventually meet up with the tiny space lab. The transmissions from it, after that one glorious whoop of joy, were professional and businesslike, dealing with the serious matters of getting a ship where it needed to be. But all the galaxy remembered the unbelievable madness of a sentient expressing pure exhilaration as nuclear fire lifted it into the sky. Galactic civilizations had a hard time agreeing on anything, but absolutely everyone agrees that the Marital are completely mad. End of story. I would like to thank our T5 members and patrons, Casper Arnholtz, John Creighton, Vidmori, 050, Dragzoon WRE, and Elijah Silvercross. Thank you very much.